TCORS. He has a wide range of interests. He's also interested in working on multidisciplinary approaches to any particular research question, and also chewing on the big complex challenge of looking at a large bank of social emotional influences that impact on tobacco product use, risk, and changes. This is a big deal. So, Josh, you're welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll try to talk over the mirror. Very kind of you to say that I've got a big crowd. I think the sandwich is almost a little hard. So I'm going to move through things fairly quickly. I've included my research page profile, and I'm also available via email. I leave tonight, but I'm responsive. So if anybody has any questions that we don't get to today, I'm happy to follow up on anything. I'll start off talking a little bit about who I am as a scholar. My personal background, I'm from Southeast Kansas. Pardon me for those who have went out to dinner with me or sat in an interview. I'm from a town of about 250 people, 80 miles east of Wichita. The relevant questions, we were 30 miles from the nearest Walmart, 15 miles from the nearest stoplight. So kind of about where I'm from. Academics, I went through the University of Kansas for my undergraduate and master's program, and I've been at UNC for the last 4 years in the School of Media and Journalism, focusing on health communications. My research focuses primarily on looking at social influence processes related to e-cigarette use and other addictive behaviors. I've also looked into how we evaluate health campaigns, and my dissertation kind of seeks to meld those, and we'll get into that more here in a second. All right. So I'm going to talk about kind of three main buckets of campaign evaluation. So there's production and distribution and evaluation. Production, pre-testing of messages, identifying audiences, distribution, figuring out channels, actually putting it into the field, and evaluation, figuring out whether or not what we've done is actually successful. The research that I'm going to be presenting today is focused mostly on production and evaluation, kind of identifying relevant audiences, figuring out what is going to make somebody either be receptive or not receptive to a message, and then ultimately evaluating whether the campaign was successful or not. So for those of us who have a comm background or a social-psychological background, I tend to think of things, especially when evaluating campaigns, in terms of theories of reason action. So that generally is attitudes, intentions, and then behaviors. So we're going to talk about this mostly in the form of development of outcome expectancies, which essentially answer the question of what do you think is going to happen if you use e-cigarettes as attitudes. Perceived message effectiveness, I'm going to back and forth between calling it DME and perceived message effectiveness, or perceived effectiveness, or effectiveness of messages, which is kind of a proxy measure for determining whether or not the messages that are seen by somebody will affect their intentions and ultimately their behaviors, and then post-exposure risk beliefs, or quit intentions, susceptibility, or smoking cessation behaviors. I'll look to extend this work for those of us, again, familiar with theories of reason action. We know that they're on the left side of the bracket. There's kind of like this hazy idea of social environment. So perceived norms, kind of your social conditioning. I look at health information from a person's social networks, or the people that they surround themselves with, as kind of a precursor to the development of relevant attitudes about e-cigarettes or cigarettes, which ultimately are impacted by, in some manner, by messages from a campaign like the Real Cause, and hopefully take the form of some form of post-exposure risk belief or susceptibility to change. Take a little bit of time to recognize the funding leading up to this dissertation work. I worked on a large grant that I'll discuss here in a little bit from NCI and NIH, and the funding for this particular dissertation was from a pilot project awarded under that award number from the University of Michigan, Georgetown. So I started off early in my doctoral program with a big systematic review of perceived message effectiveness. We looked back from 1988 to about 2016 at around 78 studies that measured in an experimental fashion whether 15 persuasive dimensions that we modeled after McGuire's model of persuasion. So one thing that was common across a number of these studies, however, was that outcome expectancies or specific beliefs about tobacco products were a common antecedent to both use and were a common antecedent to the overall effectiveness of messages. That led to my first author piece, which was kind of a nationally representative sample of adolescents and young adults. We showed them the same outcome expectancies and then modeled whether the outcome expectancies that were relevant for associating whether adolescents use e-cigarettes were the same as those for young adults. So I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm going to talk more about young adults and vaping, but one of the reasons that we look at young adults is that they're the largest demographic of adult vape users. They have a high likelihood of dual usage or transitioning from e-cigarettes to combustible cigarettes, and I know you all know this already. They're also disproportionate recipients of pro-vape media. So from that outcome expectancy paper, we were able to get just under 1,300 adolescents and just over 2,200 young adults. And here's kind of what we came up. I'll walk through this table because I know it's a little convoluted. So for adolescents and young adults, our outcome expectancies through confirmatory factor analysis shook out to 5 different dimensions. We had enjoyment, so feelings of personal experience, whether you would enjoy the flavor of e-cigarettes, whether you would be less stressed after using them, kind of what we deemed social aspects, so whether it would make you more desirable socially or not as desirable socially, advantage over cigarettes, so whether you could conceal it, whether it was likely to be more healthy than cigarettes in kind of a direct comparison, health concerns, which are fairly obvious, and smoker association, whether or not in 2016 when we feel into this, people associated smoking e-cigarettes with e-cigarettes. So enjoyment was the one thing that kind of for positive and combined models. So we had positive enjoyment, positive social aspects, and positive advantage over cigarettes. We modeled it looking just at outcome expectancies that were positive, just at outcome expectancies that were negative with health concerns and associations, and then a combined model where we included both positive and negative outcome expectancies. Enjoyment was the only one for both combined adolescent and young adults that was significant association between current e-cigarette use. Health concerns was negative kind of across the board, and interestingly enough, in 2016, only young adults had a negative association in a combined model with smoker association, which we took to mean that, young adults at that time may have been associating the use of e-cigarettes with combustible cigarettes a little bit more than young adults and adolescents. However, if you think back of the marketplace in 2016, it looks a little different than it does now. There were a lot more cig-alike and kind of like cigarette-shaped vape products than there are on the market today. So, a brief bit back to PME. We did a brief longitudinal analysis, kind of systematic review and meta-analysis of longitudinal evidence, finding that PME in some instances predicted longitudinal put intentions. So if you had higher perceived message effectiveness, you're more likely to make a quit attempt to follow up and make a cessation attempt to follow up. But more importantly, it was process. It's not an overall indicator. It's not something that it's just because you rate a message highly necessarily means that you're going to quit. I've talked about this with a few people. When we're talking about media, and particularly media effects, we're often playing at the margins. We're looking at very small media effects that can be compounded over time. And I wanted to try to figure out some of the things that would either resist or amplify that type of combination. So I did a brief pilot study for my dissertation looking at personal networks because I wanted to see how the social environment of an individual impacted combined with their baseline outcome expectancies about e-cigarettes, predicted current e-cigarette use among young adults. I'll be presenting this in Australia in May, if any of you happen to be around the Gold Coast at that time. Before I get too far into this, I want to take a brief detour by talking about personal networks. I'm going to be discussing that quite a bit from here on forward. So briefly, which is a little different than what Dr. Valente helped pioneer, which is sociocentric network analysis. I'm going to kind of describe the differences here briefly, and then we'll move forward. So sociocentric network analysis, if we were to conduct that, we might talk about whether or not we had certain beliefs about e-cigarettes or tobacco just amongst the people that are in this office or within this TCORS. And we would figure out who knows whom or who might turn to one another for various types of support. And we would model that by surveying all of us. And please, Dr. Valente, if I'm getting any of this wrong, go for it. By our various positions within this organization, we could figure out, if there's kind of a network effect on all of us or on certain individuals when it comes to our perceptions about tobacco. If we were to look at egocentric network analysis, we would look at us as individuals. So I might just take a random sampling of people that work at various TCORS, such as Adam. I would say, please talk to me about the people that you discuss your health with. Talk to me about the people that you turn to when you need help with work. Talk to me about the people that provide different types of support to you. And I would do that with other types of people that are in various TCORS and look at not just the people that they work with, but the people that they turn to for various things in their life. So the people that you discuss your health with might be your coworkers, but they might also be your friends. They might also be your family. They might also be people that you know through a rec soccer league. So when we're looking at message evaluation and campaign evaluation, it was important for me to use egocentric network analysis because it most easily folds into large survey research. When we're talking about gathering a large group of young adults that don't necessarily know each other and trying to figure out if there's a network effect on their perceptions of this certain type of campaign, it makes sense to do one where we don't necessarily have to capture everybody within that certain foci or that certain organizational level. Okay. So why do we study personal networks? It suggests that they can have a causal relationship on attitude, adoption, and maintenance. The people that we surround ourselves with can really help form our opinion and help solidify certain types of behaviors. Users networks, which you guys already know this, include higher numbers of tobacco users than non-user networks. So people that tend to be around one another can, sociosyncratically or building upon one another, encourage certain types of disadvantageous behaviors such as smoking. Finally, networks can exert normative pressure. So what we all kind of colloquially call peer pressure, networks can exert this type of pressure on others to conform with behaviors. So for this pilot study, I recruited 288 undergrads. We found the presence of two distinct discussion networks, which I'm going to go over here in a second, but there were health discussion networks and social interaction networks. And we found preliminary evidence for the importance of examining both the composition and structure of these networks in associations with current e-cigarette use for these young adults. So when I talk about the two different discussion networks, so we've got the health discussion network, HDN, and the social interaction network, SIN, and they were qualitatively different. If you think about young adults, the people that you might discuss your health with are most likely going to be people that you've known for a long time. So they had known people in their health discussion network far longer on average than they had people in their social interaction network. They were also closer on average to people in their health discussion network than their social interaction network. Their health discussion network was more supportive based on the number of support functions each one gave, but their social interaction network had more e-cigarette users. Makes sense. 18 to 25-year-olds, people that are going out with you, probably more likely to use e-cigarettes. When we talk about structure, first off, e-cigarette homophily, so the number of people that shared the same e-cigarette use status as the individuals was higher in health discussion networks than social interaction networks. That makes sense. The people that we go out with might smoke, we might not smoke, but we still enjoy their company, so we might go out to a bar. Our family members, though, if they are not tobacco users, oftentimes we may not be. Degree or the size of these networks were pretty much the same, but the density or the number of individuals within those discussion networks who knew other members within those discussion networks was different. So the social interaction networks were higher. More people within their social interaction networks knew one another than their health discussion networks, which kind of makes sense. If I list my doctor that I met on campus, along with my family members as people that I discuss my health with, my doctor might not know my parents, but my parents would know one another. Whereas the people that I go out with regularly probably all know one another because most folks don't have that fractured of a social group. When we talk about network composition, specifically I'm talking about the types of people and attitudes within a person's network. when we talk about network structure, we're talking about the connections between the individuals within this network, as well as the strength of relationships in the person's network. So we're talking about the closeness, or like how strongly connected I feel to each other person within that network. The reason we're doing all this work is because I wanted to kind of expand on the traditional use of descriptive and injunctive norms in determining whether or not somebody has baseline beliefs about e-cigarettes, and then ultimately how they react to those messages, right? So for individuals that have used descriptive or injunctive norms, this should look fairly familiar. How upset do you believe your close friends would be if you used e-cigarettes? Typical injunctive norm question. And how many of your family members do you believe use e-cigarettes? Typical descriptive norm. So when we try to get the same data with egocentric network data, we would talk about, to elicit a health discussion network, who are the people you discuss your health with or can really count on for help when you have physical or emotional problems. We ask the demographics of those alters, the types of relationships that you have with one of them, types of support, their specific tobacco usage, and connections between those alters, as well as an injunctive norm question asking whether or not each one of those individuals, like how you believe they would react if they knew that you used e-cigarettes. The bottom one there shows kind of a way that we might elicit social interaction networks. So if we look at the ego, or the individual respondent level descriptive or injunctive norm outputs, you might get a 2 on a 5-point Likert scale for your injunctive norm question, and you might get a 2 on a 5-point Likert scale for your descriptive norm question. Compare that to the individual level output for ego networks, right? So here we have an example, like an illustrative example of a health discussion network and a social interaction network from our preliminary data, all right? We can see that squares indicate non-vapors, circles with an X indicate vapors within the network, black circles or black squares indicate family members, and our arrows indicate relationships. So both who the ego knows and which alters know one another. The width of each arrow indicates the strength or the closeness of those relationships. So as we can kind of see, this is, again, illustrative. It's not based off an individual, but kind of accumulation of the types of networks that we saw. Our health discussion network has more family members, fewer vapors. It has stronger connections, but they're not as densely connected. Social interaction network has more vapors, fewer family members, and more interconnections between the alters. So for the dissertation, I wanted to kind of combine everything that I've done previously to this. So we took the outcome expectancies and perceived message effectiveness components, the outcome expectancies and e-cigarette use and personal network component of the pre-test, and added a message testing component to determine whether or not the previous, your social environment influenced your baseline beliefs, and how that interplayed when you were shown a message about e-cigarettes or vaping. So the dissertation funding sources, as I briefly mentioned, the University of Michigan and Georgetown Center for the Assessment of Tobacco Regulations, as well as the Dr. Charles V. Stewart Summer Research Fellowship Fund, which allowed me to work on it and not have to work for anybody else for a summer, which was great fun. This is kind of a breakdown of our participants. I was able to get 2,300, just over 2,300 young adults, 18 to 25. We matched fairly closely for nationally representative for gender and race. We oversampled purposely for vapors, so we had just over 1,000 vapors. The way that it worked, after IRB documentation and informed consent, they went through a personal network battery, gave baseline outcome expectancies about e-cigarettes, gave baseline e-cigarette and tobacco use susceptibility for individuals who didn't use e-cigarettes, or quit intentions for those who did, and talked about comparative risks for e-cigarettes versus traditional cigarettes. Then they were randomized to one of two conditions. Either the FDA ad condition, where they were shown 2 FDA ads from the Real Cost campaign about e-cigarettes. We were only able to do 2 because the FDA only at that time had 2 e-cigarette ads. Or a control ad condition where we showed 2 ads from, one was the Mayo Clinic and one was another kind of low suspicion talking head talking about the dangers of e-cigarettes. After those, they assessed PME for the 2 ads, and then had a follow-up for the pre-post, gave a post-exposure susceptibility and quit intentions, post-exposure risk beliefs, and a post-exposure comparative e-cigarette versus traditional cigarette beliefs. specific aims, aim 1 was to examine how young adults' personal network composition and structure affect baseline health and social outcomes associated with e-cigarettes, right? So how our personal networks kind of set the stage for our baseline beliefs about e-cigarettes. So do networks matter for strengthening these types of attitudes? One of the things that we wanted to figure out was if these networks mattered above and beyond personal use history. So when we restrict to 18 to 25-year-olds and we restrict to, nationally representative, we're necessarily going to get a lot of people that functionally appear the same. That we're going to have a lot of the same people that are about the same age, about the same household income level, about the same education level, but may vary specifically on the types of networks. So we're looking for a specific network effect on the strength of attitudes across these different outcome expectancy dimensions at baseline. Second, looking at whether or not there were direct effects from the network on perceptions of the messages that they were shown. Okay. Looking at whether or not these network effects amplify or reduce the effectiveness of these messages at first view. Okay. And finally, taking all of these, looking at personal networks, e-cigarette outcome expectancies, and message effectiveness ratings to look at changes for e-cigarette quit intentions and susceptibility at follow-up. Okay. So I'm going to present a few preliminary findings, and then we'll move forward to questions. All right. Confirmatory factor analysis revealed 2 factors for perceived message effectiveness, so message perceptions and message effects. So the message perceptions factor was the 6-item RTI scale, which has been used to kind of rubber stamp every FDA real cost campaign going back 7 or 8 years now. The message effects was a 3-item scale that was adapted from UNC research, where it's more focused on the direct effects of the message on specific outcomes. So I'm happy to talk about these factors with anybody that would prefer to talk about them, but moving forward, just know that they were both highly intercorrelated and negatively correlated with current vape status and vape frequency, which makes sense. If you vape a lot, you're probably not going to find messages about vaping highly motivating. Okay? So here we found, to no surprise, vapors found both sets of ads less effective than non-vapors, and vapors had higher negative reactance to both sets of ads than vapors. Again, not necessarily mind-blowing, but FE ads were seen as more effective for the total respondent pool. Effects perceptions, FDA rated higher than control ads for current users, and FDA ads outperformed control ads for both dimensions for non-users. But FDA ads were higher in negative reactance for all subgroups. So for the total, for current users, and for non-users.
I have a clarifying question.
Sure.
So the control ads are also anti-vape ads. You're essentially testing, are the FDA ads more effective?
Yeah, so we're looking at essentially low sensation value versus high sensation value. So this is tiny, but I'll say what's going on. So results for post-exposure addiction risk relief for a lot of anti-vaping and anti-tobacco campaigns. What they look for is whether or not people that are exposed to something in a post-exposure had higher or lower depending on condition. When we looked at this, addiction risk reliefs were, the PME effects and perception scales were both positively associated with post-exposure risk addiction beliefs. So if you had higher PME ratings, you also had higher expected risks associated for addiction with vaping, right? We had a pretty good model effect, but because we were interested in determining whether or not PME is actually a predictor or necessarily just an indicator of baseline attitudes, when we looked at whether or not it was measuring actual change or resilient beliefs, when we looked at pre-post for susceptibility, we found that we were essentially diving into a thimble, which kind of makes sense. For individuals that don't use e-cigarettes, showing them 2 30-second ads really probably won't change their perception of PME that much. So again, in our Model 3, our effects measures predict but we had kind of a tough crowd effect. So on the whole, the average went down. So after they watched these FDA ads, they had lower quit intentions by a little bit. Yeah, tough crowd. But effects measures did predict change in a positive direction, and the model effects were significant. But again, our effect sizes are super small. Like I said, we're really playing at the margins for pre-post and media effects research. Okay. So, next steps on this. We're going to break susceptibility and intention models out for control versus FDA, right? So those were kind of omnibus tests that we just ran where we took everybody that answered susceptibility and everybody that answered quit intentions. So we're going to, break it out and look at whether or not control and FDA both perform similarly in those models. Going to examine how baseline e-cigarettes outcome expectancies associated with PME scores, the effect that these baseline attitudes had in determining the PME scores, and also determine how discussion networks associate with baseline outcome expectancies. So that kind of model that we looked at previously, we finished cleaning our network data. I still need to run it through eNet so that we can run the final analyses and data. And ultimately, we're going to ideally figure out the question whether or not these message effective measures are truly measuring a change in intentions or susceptibility, or indicating kind of initial individual receptivity to a message. Are these something where we're trying to figure out, is this a tool that's best used for determining whether these are going to change intentions, or is it better used for audience segmentation to figure out what types of people are going to be initially receptive to a message? So, for major contributions that we're expecting, we're modeling social environments that might influence early campaign effectiveness, right? If we take individuals that are the same age, same race, same household income, same education level, but just differ in the network composition and structure, and that might influence early campaign effectiveness, we might know the types of people that are going to be receptive to campaigns at an early stage, and also those individuals that might pass along that information. Right? We're also introducing network level variance to audience segmentation. Right? What I mean by this is if we talk about traditional distinctions of individuals, we talk about those who are susceptible versus those who are not susceptible. And that's usually based off of scores on 1 or 2 susceptibility questionnaires, or individuals who use versus don't use, individuals who are heavy users versus not heavy users. This takes into account the types of individuals that surround us and the ways that those individuals might restrict our attitudes and beliefs and behaviors around e-cigarettes, so that we can better understand not just susceptible versus non-susceptible, but whether or not susceptible individuals with high levels of e-cigarette homophily or high levels or low levels of e-cigarette homophily might be more receptive early on to these types of campaigns. Finally, for the production side, we're going to be assessing potential competing sources of social influence for information. The fact is, we have 2 anti-e-cigarette ads from FDA that are going to be going on a national level, and they're only targeted towards teens, right? These aren't targeted towards young adults at this point. We're a little behind the ball when it comes to sources of information about the relative risks associated with e-cigarettes from a campaign standpoint. So modeling the types of networks that our individuals are enmeshed in gives us one way to kind of chart who else might be talking and who else might be influencing these baseline attitudes that individuals have that we're targeting. For evaluation, we're talking about message selection, so greater depth of analysis on social environments, supplement current message pre-testing instrumentation. Again, when we talk about audience segmentation, now we can figure out if individuals truly don't like a message, or, well, we can better figure out whether or not an individual's reaction to a message is based off of their previous e-cigarette use and or demographics, or if it's kind of a holdover from the social environment in which they're enmeshed. Also helps with key performance indicators, so identification of relevant personal networks for longitudinal campaign evaluation. We talked about the discussion of health discussion networks and social interaction networks, how they were qualitatively different and how they function a little bit differently in determining current e-cigarette use. One thing that I'm hoping to extend this conversation in this dissertation is figuring out which types of discussion networks might be most relevant for including in evaluation of campaign effects. So if we're talking about a campaign that's talking about the health aspects of e-cigarette use? Is it more useful to talk about health discussion networks, or is it always going to be important to talk about the social interaction networks that people are enmeshed in as well? Okay. The reason that's important is because we're ultimately looking for amplification or message resistance, right? We're looking for, once we release this at baseline, who's going to be more prepared, whose networks will amplify or increase initial resistance to these messages, but also over the course of a campaign, what types of networks are going to be most amplifying or most resistant to these types of messages. And finally, for the diffusion of campaign messages through networks, right? We talk about earned media all the time. One of the kind of gold standards of campaign evaluation for anti-tobacco campaigns is trying to figure out predictions of what leads an individual to actually talk about a health campaign. Individuals like Emily Brennan, Sarah Durkin, and Melanie Wakefield in Australia have been doing a number of studies trying to predict what leads people to talk about it. And thus far, I think that their most significant finding is that if you're in the room with somebody when a campaign ad comes on, you might talk to that person. I think that adding in personal network information and talking about the strength and connectivity of these networks might better lead us through longitudinal evaluations to figure out what types of messages as well as what types of networks are going to be most conducive to diffusing these messages. So moving forward, I would like to ultimately build in a longitudinal component of this. This is pre-post. We are diving into a symbol, and networks are necessarily dynamic, right? So when we talk about the effectiveness of a campaign or an intervention over the course of its lifetime, we have to think about the way that these networks might change along the way, right? Are we actually seeing variance in behaviors or beliefs or attitudes associated with the types of messages that we're seeing or the types of interventions that we're doing, or are we getting noise from the different types of individuals that people are interacting with on a regular basis and how that might change over the course of an intervention? So thank you for listening to me talk.
Deliverer of that message, and that is that it's both sort of authority or governmental voices delivering the message. And I'm wondering, with teens, governmental voices are not always credible or noticeable, or they just don't care. And I'm wondering in the future, and it feels like this all is sort of leading to this anyway, is sort of looking at different deliverers of the message, especially the way that young people consume media now. That it is a lot of influencers, it's a lot of sort of voices that feel like peers. Mm-hmm. And so I was just curious about if you see that where this is going, or because I've been in tobacco control for many years, and teens have always been resistant to governmental voices. So.
No, absolutely. Source credibility is huge. Figuring out whether or not people believe that the FDA is an actual authority on e-cigarettes versus somebody whose YouTube channel that they watch quite regularly that might also be a sponsored influencer for the e-cigarette company. One of the main reasons that I chose this particular path is because I am also kind of a skeptic when it comes to the true message effects of these campaigns, right? We know that they're massively expensive, but we also know that they're more targeted methods, right? If we can identify the types of individuals, and especially through digital social media targeting, if we can figure out the types of individuals who maybe they follow one or two e-cigarette companies, but they don't have a lot of people in their networks that are posting e-cigarette ads, maybe targeted messaging about the specific effects of specific products to those individuals could be more relevant and effective than big national campaigns. It's trying to figure out how we can use our limited resources more effectively.
The way I would look at this is I would construct an exposure term and expect that the vapors who have a lot of vapors in the network are less likely to change their outcomes, the expectancies as well as the susceptibility and intention. Those with fewer vapors in their network would be more likely to change, right, because they're not constrained by all that behavior in the network. And then I would build an interaction term not only between that network exposure term, but then the density, the connectivity of the network, right? Because if all my friends vape, but they're not connected to each other, they're less likely to influence me than if all my friends are vapors and they're all connected to one another, right?
Would you be willing to talk to me on the phone? Thank you.
The other thing that you can do is turn all those egocentric networks into little sociometric ones and calculate your centralization, transitivity rates, and all that stuff and see if they do anything.
Oh, great. Thank you.
The third thing is to turn it into a dyadic data set. Look at that.
We absolutely have to talk more. Okay.
And then your control conditions for the app.
Sure.
It was on the same general content?
Yeah, so they were talking about like health effects of e-cigarettes, but it was very much like a person in a suit like that was identified as a doctor talking about, like, we don't really know there's these types of long-term effects, we know about addiction, and it was either from like the Mayo Clinic or I can't remember the public health organization that the second one was from, but they were necessarily low sensation value messages. And the reason that I wanted to do like that dynamic is like historically kind of high sensation or more graphic messages tend to score better on the perception scale that RTI uses than low sensation messages. So we want to see whether or not that actually carried through to changes in what intentions for young adults for e-cigarettes.
But was that control condition based on ads that were already out there and disseminated?
No, well, they were disseminated on YouTube. So, the FDA real cost ones that we used were being hyper-targeted towards teens because FDA had like some preliminary data based off of the study of about 300 young adults suggesting that exposure to those messages kind of closed the gap in expected health risks, comparative health risks between e-cigarettes and combustible cigarettes. So our understanding was that it wouldn't be readily available for individuals to see those FDA real cost campaigns, and the low sensation value messages that we used had essentially no viewership. So we thought that it would most likely be the first exposure for a number of young adults to both types of messages.
I see. Because I was trying to think of what the control actually meant, and I was wondering if it was typical. I mean, in some of our other research, sometimes you'll have a health education as usual control, or a clinical assessment as usual control. But this was a little different, because it was different in terms of sensation seeking. Okay.
In retrospect, do you regret including non-vapors in your sample?
It's a loaded question.
I thought it was a great idea, and then I saw the susceptibility numbers. But honestly, no. It's like we've done kind of like an omnibus, like hierarchical regression, predicting changes in susceptibility. I still think that there's more detailed analyses that we can look at, kind of using standard deviations to tease out whether or not like specific types of networks for susceptible people might be more conducive to accepting messages about the inherent risks of e-cigarettes than other types of networks for susceptible folks. So I think that there's still some analysis that could show some variance in there, but yeah, it was disheartening to get that average for the change.
Now, I remember we did a big campaign in Bolivia, and there was all this hype about including men in contraceptive decision-making. So our sample was half women and half men. We had no effects on that, It's like, I want it. Well, it's half my power.
So this is not what you focus on exactly, but it's interesting to me that you're studying the effect of an online advertising messaging campaign and the relationships between that and offline social networks. But I'm curious about your thoughts on the relationship between the offline social networks and the online social networks. So in YouTube, I don't know how strong those network relationships are, but if you think about if social media is the platform for is a really accessible platform for dissemination of messaging, what the relationship between online behavior and in social networks and offline.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if there was
adolescents, a lot of their online communications are with people they know in real life, right?
Is that,
Well, for my kids. I don't know about others.
it's mixed, I mean, there is overlap, but you gotta factor in things like, kind of what the technology tells us to do, which is the friends of our Facebook friends, we might not do them, but because they are the friend of someone that we do know. So there also is potential to identify more observed ties in those online networks than we would probably observe in like nominated networks. So it's kind of, I mean, it's a nice mixed bag, right? You can get a little bit of overlap,
Yeah.
but.
Do you have any way to measure or reason to believe that the networks in the case group would be overlapped with the networks in the control group, and how that might impact?
So we did Qualtrics panels. We operate under the assumption that they don't. And because it was Qualtrics panels pulled from a number of other different like recruiting companies and like kind of nationally representative, and we're assuming from different locales that there's probably not a lot of overlap, but we can't 100% rule it out.
What's your impression that the folks who design these campaigns are going to be receptive to your suggestions of how to make things better? And, I mean, it's not a scientific question, it's like a pragmatic question. So,
I would hope that they would be. I'm honestly, I think the only thing that I can do with this dissertation at this point is write it up and try to match it to the specific aims of that the FDA is looking for as possible. We did well with our RFA for pilot funding, and our reviewer scores suggested that there might be some positive reception to either the audience segmentation or like trying to figure out for the campaign evaluation standpoint. But yeah, I mean that's obviously incredibly tough. If this just doesn't go anywhere with the people that are creating these types of campaigns, then that wouldn't be great.
then what?
Then what?
Yeah. And just in a serious way, like from my limited understanding, these campaigns get released, then they give a lot of money to a specific group to evaluate it in a contract standpoint, and usually those things turn out pretty positive for the campaign designer. So let's just say they're not interested in what your findings are, maybe they are, maybe they're not. But maybe if you couch this study in kind of a media exposure study rather than a health campaign study, or rather than even more specifically a tobacco one, you can answer a broader research question with the method that you're employing. This is something to think about in terms of framing.
Okay.
So two questions. Did you find any like kind of demographic differences in these effects, like as like either moderators or like, I mean, like how old these kids were, race, ethnicity, like
so for
in terms of any of these outcomes?
Okay, yeah. So
Table's a really small site.
no, it's okay. So we didn't really find any significant associations between age, sex, race, or there was some for education level, like negative associations with quit intentions. So the more educated individuals were less likely to change quit intentions based off of these message. But no, like for a lot of demographics, at least in these initial regressions, we didn't find too many associations at all.
And what about like just parental smoking behavior? Did you control for that?
No, we didn't ask that.
But it would show up in the network data.
Only if they
If they say
if they end up
yeah.
parent is when they talk about health, and a lot
Oh, yeah,
a lot of
that's
kids
not
do
gonna do
not
that.
talk to
Yeah.
their parents about health if they do things.
Yeah, one of the other questions, so we tried to elicit just general tobacco usage within networks by asking them to identify 5 individuals that they knew who used some form of tobacco product. You would assume that if they grew up with their parents as smokers, that they would be top of mind enough to be listed within that first 5. So we can go back from that specific discussion network name generator and see whether or not parents were used in that, but that's not in the initial analyses that I've ran.
So the name generator, you're using the average number of people they nominated for each of the vote sort of size, but was it quite variable? Did you see a lot of?
presented here is a lot of the ego level, just the individual respondents, so like their individual reactions, their individual usage, and like their individual demographics. We're going to add in the actual network aspects of it over the next couple of weeks.
Got it. I guess I'm asking to understand, for most folks, then, this is a very close-knit group of people, like their 5 closest
Yeah, so
ties.
from the,
You may not be picking up on some of the variability of like vaping in their bigger social world.
yeah, so from, from our preliminary, like our pilot data, the density did tend to vary quite a bit. So 0.46, when you think about density, that's kind of think of it like the percentage of potential connections, right? So just under half of the people within their health discussion networks tended to know one another. Their social interaction network was just about 3/4. Closeness was fairly close, but there was a significant difference in there, even at 288. I think that as you build it out to folks that aren't necessarily going to a fairly cloistered public university in North Carolina and you have like kind of a wider range of experiences, I would expect there to be more variance in tie strength because we not only assess closeness, but we also ask communication frequency. So that like we have a little bit more of a sophisticated measure of tie strength that should allow a little bit more variance.
Yeah, I guess, so maybe my point wasn't super clear, but if we should assume people know like 300 or so folks, like that's their size of their contact network, and so sampling 5 of those 300, like what are the implications of that if you're capturing like really their closest ties and those vaping behaviors versus like what they might get exposed to? Like,
yeah, so I mean the trade-off is respondent burden, right? So even with this, like it was about a 25-minute survey. So if you blow it up to about 10, then you've got like a 45-minute survey, and it severely limits the number of people that are actually willing to sit there through that. We based it off of some kind of best practices for egocentric network research, saying that if you ask people from 5, it's going to tend to be the people that are like most top of mind when you're like giving that quote. So if you tell people to list 15, by the time that you're about 10 to 15, you might really be stretching to figure out like who do I really discuss this about. So we figured 5 would elicit people that are
I have just a measurement question. When you asked about perceived message effectiveness, I know you assessed a lot of different approaches. Was there one that you thought was the most useful approach?
Yeah, so that was one of the reasons that we added in effects-based. So Market Reserve up in Minnesota has a really good theoretical argument about perceived message effectiveness, which essentially states that the effectiveness measures that you're using should be as close as possible to like the purposes of the ad that you're assessing, right? If the advertisement is trying to talk about the health discussion, or the networks on the brain, if it's talking about like health effects of addiction or the health effects of nicotine, you should have your effectiveness measures kind of tailored to ask whether or not those aspects are coming through most saliently. The perceptions measures that we use, and this is going to be borne out in research that's coming out of UNC, tend to elicit better, like kind of tentative responses. So things that would grab your attention, but not necessarily the ones that get people thinking about like actual effects or like the things that we believe are going to be most correlated with changes in intention or risk beliefs.
Okay. And then when you measured attenuation and amplification, were you looking at beliefs about certain things?
Yeah, so we did have post-exposure risk beliefs that factored into 2 factors, one of which were all about like kind of the health effects of e-cigarettes, and then the other one was concerns about addiction risk.
Okay.
So with the social interaction network, what exactly was the generator, the new generator?
So I don't know if it was.
They responded to?
I don't know if it was exactly this. Like it was something to this effect. Over the last 6 months, who were the 5 people you have been with most for informal social activities? And then we gave a couple examples of informal social activities, just like going out to the restaurant.
Those are more like for proximity networks. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, did you ask any questions about what they actually discussed? Because that's not a discussion network.
No.
Like, exactly, it's precisely, I mean, or it could be a discussion.
But the
network.
person
Without an
It's
actual-
it's not a friend network either necessarily, although
it's
probably
a hanging out network,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's a hanging
So,
out.
which kind of has an aspect of physical locality, these are people that you are physically around, like,
But that's the social interaction network, right? And then the
Yeah.
discussion one is the top prompt, the who do you talk to?
Yeah.
Do people generally hang out with one another and not speak?
No.
Are they married or not?
So you didn't ask anything about the kind of things they thought about in the...
No, we asked, whether or not each individual had ever offered, if they indicated that the individual used tobacco products, we asked whether or not they had ever offered to buy or share tobacco products with the other person, but we didn't get into specific discussions. We did, when we talked about social support, we said they listened to me, they offered emotional support and other types of supportive functions, but we didn't get into actual topical discussions.
But the research has shown that people talk about inane things, right? The phony has its fraud.
Yeah.
That's actually the title of the paper.
I have just one more question. I'm just curious about if you looked at sort of these results and how it compared to teens' reactions or responses or connection to other health effect messaging that isn't around tobacco. I always just think about teens as being sort of having kind of that idea of health effects are far, far in the future for me, so that rationale doesn't apply to me right now, so other things do, other factors contribute to my decision making. So I'm just curious about how these results compare to teens responding to other health effect messaging, if that. I mean, it certainly exists in probably combustible cigarettes.
Yeah, so, when we did the comparative outcome expectancy study, we found that, when you're just trying to model associations for e-cigarette use between young adults and adolescents, the outcome expectancies were pretty much the same. Perceptions of personal experience or enjoyment were positively associated, health concerns were negatively associated. And they were, the associations were stronger, in the logistic regression, those outcome expectancies were all stronger for young adults than they were for adolescents, but they were still significant, largely significant in the same directionality and with the same domain.
Marianne, unless there anyone else.
Do you have any last questions for us?
What do I do if FDA doesn't care?
Well, but I think your comment about the topic of the message is really relevant, right? Kids respond to other kids, and they respond to entertainment and
They respond to peers. They
Yeah,
make their
they-
decisions based on what they heard.
It would be really interesting, so along this, just for future things to think about, if you were to kind of replicate this maybe at a larger scale, would be to ask them, give some kind of information about whether they'd be more likely to quit if their friends quit. So which would help get to how important their friends' behavior actually is in determining their own behavior.
or parody messages. Kids love parody messages.
I mean, we have done only qualitative work with teens around vaping, and the sort of most credible voices are definitely friends, but they're also Shane Dawson or the YouTube celebrity that they love. They feel very much